Today I have, I guess you can call this a bonus video. I'm going to preach something else. So we're going to be in Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. So here we have Moses. He was tending a flock of sheep one day, and all of a sudden he sees a bush that's on fire, and he decides to go investigate it because the bush, while it was on fire, the bush wasn't being consumed. The bush wasn't, there was no singes, there was no burn, it wasn't ashered, it wasn't anything like that. So he wanted to go investigate it, and meanwhile, and then of course God talks to him here. So who was Moses? Um, he was this, back in the beginning of Exodus, the Pharaoh decided he feared that an uprising might come out of one of the Hebrew males, so he orders that they all be killed, and eventually the women start putting their eventually, the women try and do what they can to get out of this because they want to honor God. And one of them puts Moses in a basket, and uh, it's found by the I believe it was the daughter of Pharaoh. So she takes him and raises him. So he's this Egyptian guy. But at some point he learns about his lineage, and he decides to go and see the Hebrew people that are slaves in Egypt. And when he gets there, one of the first things he sees is this Egyptian beating one of the Hebrew slaves. So he kills the Egyptian that was beating the Hebrew slave. And then a few days later, he goes back and finds two Hebrews arguing with each other. And he tries to mediate the fight, but then they turn on him and say, "Didn't you just kill someone the other day? So why don't you just kill us?" So he fears. So now Moses is afraid. So he flees the kingdom of Egypt and goes into exile. And he winds up in the he winds up in the middle of this shepherd flock, and he meets this guy named. Eventually, he meets this guy named Jethro and marries one of his daughters, and he, works on the flock. So that's kind of a little bit of the history of Moses. Um, in this, we can find in the first 1 through 4, we can find God's call. He was very direct. He wasn't like, oh, Moses, can you come over here? He was, Moses. He called him directly. And and then of course Moses had no doubt it was God, because his answer is here I am. Now let's read 3:5 through 10. Then he said, "Do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." He said also, "I am the Lord, the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Then Moses hid his face, and he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, "I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their suffering. So I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, to land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite. Now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore, come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt." So here we have so so here so here God was speaking to Moses. Not once in this the what is it 5 through 10 did Moses speak to God. He just listened to God. He was in awe of God. He was he had this encounter with God, and so he just allowed God to speak. Now, in this, God's basically said that he's heard the cry of his people, and he wants Moses to go to Pharaoh so that he can bring the sons of he can bring the Hebrews out. So let's go on and read 11 through 15. But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt?" And he said, "Certainly I will be with you, and this shall be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain." Then Moses said to God, "Behold, I am going to the sons of Israel, and I will say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. Now they may say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am as has sent to you." God furthermore said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial name to all generations." So Moses begins to doubt. He didn't really. You some people would say no, he didn't trust an all-powerful God. Um, in some ways, I'm not sure if I know if that's true. You see, Moses was looking at what he could do, and as Moses was, he could do nothing. I mean, he had already tried to help out the Hebrews twice. He tried to save that guy who was being beaten, and then he tried to mediate a fight, and they basically didn't. They basically, were like, "Why don't you just kill us, too?" He was relying on his own ability. But you see, God wasn't sending Moses, directly to go and free the Hebrews. It was God who was going to free the Hebrews. He was just sending Moses as a mediator. He was going to go to Pharaoh and say, God says you need to let the people go. He was basically, throughout the Old Testament, God used different prophets to go and talk to the kings and the rulers of the earth. And oftentimes, usually if a prophet came, it wasn't always a joyful thing. Usually it was, the prophet showed up and they're like, "This is what you're doing that God doesn't like right now." So usually, if a prophet came, it would probably go to the point where you're like, "Oh boy, what am I doing now?" So basically, Moses wasn't seeing that. It was God who was going to free the Hebrews, not, Moses. And an interesting thing I'll point out is, um, God ends up challenging. You see, when Moses asks the question, "Who shall I say who sent me?" Because you see, Egypt had all kinds of gods. They had Ra, they had everything they worshipped. They worshipped the Nile. They worshipped frogs. In fact, every one of the plagues that God did was basically attacking the gods of Egypt. From the plague of the Nile, which was when God turned the river into blood, into the last plague, which was destroying the firstborn son, and it ended up God destroyed Pharaoh's firstborn son, which pharaohs were also gods there, so he was taking on all the gods, and so some other things that Moses might have been thinking is God's giving me more than we can handle. Then we might be thinking God gives us more than we can handle, but when that happens, when we feel like this forces us to rely on God. In the story, Moses couldn't have freed the Hebrews. He wouldn't have stood a chance. He would have had to go against the mighty Egyptian army and things like that. Which in the end, the army does come after the Hebrews, but God has justice. You see, it's kind of funny at the beginning of the story. The Pharaoh was having the Hebrews thrown into the Nile, drowning them. But what happens at the end of the story? What happens is, the Hebrews cross the Red Sea gets part of the Hebrews cross it, and then the Egyptians go in after. But then the Nile drowns the army. So there's God's justice there. You drowned the Hebrews, and now I'm going to drown your army. So we can't do it on our own. Now let's look at Exodus 3:19 through 20. But I know that the king of Egypt will not permit you to go except under compulsion. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my miracles, which I shall do in the midst of it, and after that he will let you go. I will grant I will grant this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and it shall be that when you go you will not go empty-handed, but every woman shall ask of her neighbor and the woman who lives in her house articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing, and you will put them on your sons and daughters. Thus you will plunder the Egyptians. So so in God's eyes, Moses, the Hebrews were already going to be free in this event. Moses was going to go, and there were going to be some strife between Moses, Pharaoh, which ultimately wasn't between Moses and Pharaoh. It was between God and Pharaoh. It was God versus Pharaoh. And whenever God battles anything, if God was to battle Satan, Satan always loses, God always wins. And in this event, Pharaoh had already lost, and God had already won. So all the Hebrews ended up leaving Egypt. So God gave victory to Moses, and the same thing would be true for us. If God sends us out to battle something, and it doesn't even have to be a direct, like a war battle. It could be, maybe He sent us on the mission field, and we have to battle the non-believers. Well, God's already gave us victory. Why? Because it's not our mission; it's God's mission. So, what hard thing is God calling you to do this year? You could say, suppose you're a student at school. What are you going to be satisfied with? Are you going to be satisfied to be as popular as possible, or care about the outcasts or kids who don't have friends? The interesting thing about that statement is, if you're wanting to be popular on earth, this popularity is going to die. However, if you're in with God's kingdoms, and you're helping out those outcasts, then you have the Holy Spirit. You're already popular in heaven and among the angels. Are you going to be comfortable, going to your church or your youth group and being comfortable every week and just going? Or are you going to be, or would you rather invite some people who aren't saved or something like that and have them come with you? Are you going to be satisfied that? Are you just going to be satisfied that you're not going to hell? Or are you going to be satisfied sharing the gospel with those who are going to hell? I'd hope that you'd be satisfied sharing the gospel with those who are going to hell. I'd encourage you to read a book called The One Thing You Can't Do in Heaven. I think it's by Mark Cahill. He talks about trying to witness to people. He gives a statistic. I can't remember the statistic, but it was like, if I remember correct, maybe it was like 80%, but I could be wrong, of people who are now 60 and had been born and raised in the church, they have never brought up Jesus at all, whether it was at work or just one of their friends. And this, to me, this is mind-boggling. If you truly call these people your friends, if you have friends or loved ones, eventually you should share the gospel with them. Otherwise, how can you call them friends, and how can you call them family, and how can you call them people you love? Because if you're truly their friend, and if you truly love them, you don't want them to go to destruction. You don't want them to be harmed. Yet if you don't tell them about it, you're letting them go into hell. I mean, yeah, you can say that they've hardened their heart, but if you don't share with them, if you don't share them about what Jesus has done, if you don't preach the gospel, in a way, you're just sitting back and not doing anything. So anyway, that's all I wanted to share today. I hope you enjoyed it, and take care.